Soy Mariana Campero, directora general del Consejo Mexicano de Asuntos Internacionales, y es realmente para mí un privilegio poder contar hoy con la presencia de 3 académicos expertos en el tema de cómo la geopolítica y el deporte se unen y muchas veces son utilizados como un elemento de propaganda y de influencia. And I will switch to English as courtesy to our guest Victoria. And with that, I would just introduce our great panel this afternoon. Dr. Victoria Jackson, she's a sports historian at ASU. Welcome to Mexico, Victoria. A real pleasure to have you here. Dr. Mauricio Meschoulam, he's a professor at Universidad Iberoamericana, as well as a friend and a member of COMEXI. Always a pleasure to have you, Mauricio.
Thank you very much.
And Andrés Martínez, professor at Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at ASU. Andrés, thank you so much for such a wonderful idea, in addition. I will now pass the microphone to Andrés, who will be leading this conversation for about 45 minutes. And after that, we will have time for a Q&A session with the audience. Thank you very much. It is being recorded. We will have it up on the website of COMEXI as well as on social media. So, welcome and thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Mariana. And thanks to all of you for being here, and Mauricio and Victoria. This is very exciting. As those who know me well have come to discover, I become a bit of a crazy person during this month of the World Cup. Or maybe I revert back to being the person I was when I was 10 or 12. And there's some people here who knew me back then. But that's one of the wonderful things about these big sporting events, is the continuity they bring to your life. Every 4 years there's a World Cup, there's an Olympics, and part of our adoration for these events has to do with nostalgia, and it has to do with remembering what that meant to you when you were small. And as for countries, what certain special World Cups or Olympics might have meant for them at different periods of history. And it's an escape at some level from other topics that are less pleasant or more divisive, like politics. I understand there's an election on July 1st. And the United States, of course, we've fixed the problem of politics. We don't have divisive, ugly politics. So, I'm just kidding. But I do want to just segue and talk a little bit that while at an individual level, I feel that sport it's part of my relaxation, it's part of my escape. What brings us here today is to talk about how, in fact, sport does have tremendous political importance. It is a way in which societies and communities brand themselves, create social cohesion or divisiveness vis-a-vis others. It's a way in which nation states and governments can project a certain image and so-called soft power. So my background was I studied law, I studied history, and then I became a journalist. And I always felt that I needed to prove that I was a very serious person. So I was very passionate about sports on the side, and I played soccer, and I was a big fan. But in my day job, I felt like I had to write. I wrote for newspapers on the opinion pages, and I always felt like I had to write about politics and economics and serious subjects, because I was a serious person, capital S, capital P. And I am no longer a serious person in the sense that I realized a few years back that really one of the things that intellectually interested me the most was the way in which sport, this part of my life that I felt was my relaxation weekend hobby, how that really is very important to all aspects of what we do and to all aspects of society, business, culture, how people connect with each other and to place. I think there's nothing more fundamental than sports fandom. We've seen it yesterday and today here in Mexico. what could bring Mexicans together like beating Germany in a World Cup? There are very few things, and arguably nothing, across social, geographic, ethnic lines. So I decided that I was going to be all in terms of writing and studying the importance of sport in culture. And one of the things that really interests me is, as somebody who spends a lot of time in the U.S. likes to think that it is the leader in defining and creating content that is shared across borders when it comes to popular culture. But I feel like sport is an exception to that. Sport is not something that the U.S. has completely dominated, and I think there's a lot to that that's very healthy. So I'm currently doing a research project on looking at the English Premier League as an example of how the globalization of that league has impacted the identity of people in various communities in England and how they see their relationship to their world. Because most of their clubs in the English Premier League that have been the most important local institutions going back to the 19th century and iconic to a very particular place are now owned by American billionaires, Chinese billionaires, Russian billionaires. They're coached by foreign coaches. The majority of players are foreign. The level of play gets better. You're bringing in the best from all over the world. That's globalization at work. But you also have some dislocation with people feeling, well, is this still ours? So that's kind of a research project that I am conducting this year. But there are many ways in which how sport affects commerce, culture, politics really interest me. And tonight I really want to focus on events like the World Cup and the Olympics. Why are they so important to a government, say, for example, Vladimir Putin's, and what that is about. So that's, by way of background, who I am and what I'm intrigued by, and how I had this breakthrough a few years back that I could be a serious person and study sport, which I think is actually a very serious subject and often isn't recognized as such among academics and intellectuals. And I was guilty of thinking, ooh, I can't write about that. This is something I'm passionate about, but that's less serious than writing about economics or politics. So Mauricio, let me ask you, you strike me as somebody who still is a serious person. You are a renowned international relations, political scientist, expert, not far. Not far from here at the Ibero. But what is your perspective on the influence and impact of sport on your subject matter, which is the relationships between states and international relations? And am I crazy to think that this is actually a very important topic that sometimes gets underappreciated?
We were just talking about that, right, before this conversation. Well, thank you very much for the invitation, and it is a great honor to be with you two, having this conversation together. Let me answer. I think we would have to make a separation between what is the activity of sports as a cultural activity, as a daily activity, where you can have, sports in the streets or sports programs adequately supervised, which is in fact demonstrated to be a peace builder. If they're properly supervised, if they're, you have an adequate program, so forth. And this distinction between this kind of activity and massive events such as the World Cup or the Olympics, because there you're not only talking about sports. You cannot talk only about sports. The sports is the centerpiece of this show, spectacle, but it is a show, it is a spectacle, so you get a massive audience. And it is, a huge amount of money invested and a lot of attention from everywhere. Right. Because of that, an event such as a World Cup gets to become something else, and something that can be used as propaganda, or can be used as the projection of a certain country, such as Russia right now, or can also become a theater for the expression of different conflicts between different countries who are participating in these events. So you get intertwined, you would say, the sports activity with the international relations situation of the time. You can call it the Cold War, and then there is a boycott from the US, not going to the Soviet Union Olympic Games in 1980, or 4 years later, the Soviet Union and all the bloc not coming to the US event. So there's an international relations issue that gets intertwined with the sports activity, and all that comes with that. We have plenty of examples. We were the other day just discussing a number of examples in the mail. We have several examples of that, but I would answer that just to put it there in the conversation.
Right. Thank you. Victoria is a sports historian and teaches courses on the history of the United States through sports, the Olympic movement. She'll never tell you this, but she was a professional athlete and a national champion in the U.S. in the 10,000 meters. So congratulations for that. But how do you, when you look back as a historian and when you teach your students about, say, what Mauricio was talking about, the classic example is 1936, the Olympics, hosted by Adolf Hitler. There's a debate in the United States, and obviously the interest of the Nazi regime at that period, and again, they weren't even the first, and they certainly weren't the last regime that wanted to use an event like this to project a certain image to the world of who we are, and look at us. We can organize this tremendous event, and we can be very competitive, and we can welcome you with open arms, and it's also a message to your own people that we are a respected member of the international community because the international community has chosen to bring the Olympics or World Cup to our country. That's a big motivation for Putin right now. On one level, he's being isolated by the Western democracies on a lot of fronts. On the other level, he can tell his people, there's no problem here, they brought the World Cup to me. But take us back to Berlin 1936, and what were the debates like in that moment in the United States about whether or not to participate, and how do you think we should think of these events? I mean, as a matter of fairness, should we spread around Olympics and World Cups across the world and have every major country have its turn? Or should we see it as a reward that you're supposed to give to countries that meet certain criteria or standards? How do you resolve that tension?
We're going to solve it right here, right now. So first, thank you for having me. This is a beautiful city and one of my favorite places to run. So I got to run this morning in Chapultepec, and that was fantastic. And thank you for the idea, Andrés, and it's great to be here. So my colleagues in history, much like you were saying, don't see sport as sophisticated. It's an escape from the things that take lots of intellectual capacity, and that's when we can just relax and kick around a ball because it's just a game, right? And I love debunking that. I literally came to a faculty meeting once with like stacks of books to show that sport matters, and that we can use sport as a window into things that are actually hard to put your finger on when it comes to power dynamics in a society, or power dynamics across borders and that sort of thing. And we see ideas about bodies play out most explicitly in the space of sport because sport is about bodies, so we see those power dynamics and those struggles most explicitly in this space. But speaking to Berlin 36, there's so many different ways to tell a story, and the stories that become part of the master narrative, are really important, but then the stories behind that are what I like to do in the classroom. So, when you tell students much of the ritual and much of the kind of things that we associate with the Olympic movement that have, we think, been there from time immemorial, were actually innovations of the Nazis. The torch relay was introduced in Berlin in '36, and the official Olympic films were all modeled on this film that was very much like to demonstrate Aryan supremacy to the world, that was produced to focus on those Olympic Games. And then we have the kind of, alternative narrative that's thrown in, and that is Jesse Owens, the American athlete, the African-American sprinter who ruins Hitler's party, right, to prove Aryan supremacy, except that this African-American athlete from the United States wins 4 gold medals, right? So that's a powerful narrative, and that's really important. And then we have another story behind the stories, which is that the Americans played perhaps the most important role in making sure Berlin hosted those games. Because one of the most important people and most powerful people, right, if we're using sport to look at power, was Avery Brundage, who at the time was the head of the American Olympic Committee and went on to lead the International Olympic Committee for decades after that. And he was an unapologetic anti-Semite and racist. And so and it wasn't just the US that was thinking about boycotting. The strongest voices against going to those games were from other European countries. And he went and met with people and convinced them that the games must go on. And his legacy, he casts a dark shadow over the Olympic movement in many ways. He was responsible for the ways in which the African-American athletes in the Mexico City '68 games were treated after their very powerful, I would argue, patriotic protest on the podium. So, that this is just kind of a little bit, and you can see I'm a historian and a professor, so I talk and talk and talk and talk. But that's just a little taste of what we do in a sports history class.
It is fascinating to think about, what are the right standards. We go to the Berlin Olympics, and a couple of generations later, at the height of the Cold War, the U.S. boycotts the Olympics in Moscow because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which interrupted a long period of time where you referred to this, Mauricio, the Olympics and sport was a venue for conflict to occur that, and some people, my university president at ASU, my boss, he's one of the people who says, this is one of the great things about sport. You can have it out on the field, and that sure is a lot better than going to war, right? So the medal counts, and there are certain, when you look back to the socialist countries of that era, the East Germans and Cubas, those countries felt that sport was a way to validate the superiority of their system. This was the proof, right? And they went to really tragic lengths to ensure that they succeeded in sport to make that point, with the horrendous doping scandals, and even more recently. So this is part of where Vladimir Putin is undermining his own efforts in some ways. He spent a lot of political capital and a lot of literal capital to get the Sochi Olympics in 2014 and the 2018 World Cup. And whatever warm, fuzzy feelings you had about the Sochi Winter Olympics, which a lot of Russians did not, because the government reportedly spent $50 billion on that Olympics and rebuilding Sochi in ways that were also riddled with corruption for his cronies. But the Olympics, as they usually are, was beautiful, it was great. But whatever warm, fuzzy feelings you had about it after that was undermined by learning that there was this massive state-sanctioned doping program. So anybody who still is thinking, as I used to, well, sports can't be that serious. When you look at the lengths to which a regime to validate itself will go to host these games, to invest in these games, and in some cases to cheat because they have something to prove, that in and of itself is very telling. I was in the United Kingdom doing some of my research in March when there was this alleged attack by the Russians to try to kill one of their former spies in England, Skripal and his daughter, using like a nerve agent. And so there was this debate in England that we, again, have over history. Well, maybe we should protest by not going to the World Cup. And most British people are saying that's absolutely crazy. You know, we want to cheer our team on at the World Cup. Like, we're not doing that. And I do think it's harder to boycott a World Cup than an Olympics, just in terms of the passion around that one sport, your national team. Nobody likes to see an Olympics boycotted, but it's really hard to boycott a World Cup. But what the British government did instead was say, we're going to do a state boycott. So Prince William, who heads up the English Football Association, pulled out of going. Nobody from the English government's going. And they talked most Western European leaders out of going. So again, Putin's behavior kind of got in the way of a certain image and scenario he wanted to have, to be surrounded by all these world leaders. He did get to sit during the inaugural game, if you watched it, palling around with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, which was good for him, and probably they had important discussions on the sideline. But by and large, he's not getting a lot of heads of state, noteworthy heads of state, to go to his party because of the way he's been behaving. I watched a clip of Russian news before I came here, where they were talking up all the great foreign leaders that were coming to Mother Russia to watch the World Cup, and they had a lot of minutes on the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, because that is a nice change for that relationship between those two countries. But they were also bragging about the president of Azerbaijan, you know, who's a former Soviet client. It's not exactly Prince William and Kate. And they also had the president of Paraguay, for some reason, decided to go. And boy, they were giving him, you know, you would have thought he is the... yeah, so no offense to Paraguay, but they really were trying to hype that up. So, but it was interesting to see this debate in England. Should we go? Should we not go? Mauricio, I want to take us now back 50 years. This is an important year in Mexico, with the 1968 anniversary of the Olympics and all that surrounded that Olympics. And Mexico had the combination that Putin has this time, that Brazil recently had, of an Olympics and a World Cup close together at a key juncture in Mexican history, when Mexico was also trying to use these events to project a certain image in the world as a modern, emerging country. You know, there's a cliche that this is often a coming out party for a country. The South Koreans had their Olympics in their moment. But talk us through a little bit what that meant for Mexico, and how, in the Mexican context, sport may be politicized or not at different periods of time. And that one comes to mind, but if you have other thoughts.
Okay, I think it's a pretty good question. An event such as an Olympic Games or a World Cup, like the one that Mexico had 2 years after that, 1970, are the ideal events to show, first of all, that a country has a good normality, that this country has power, has a good way of organizing things, and is a good host, and there's a number of messages that a country projects through these events. Now, what happens if an opposition group or even a non-state actor, it can be, as it happened in Sochi, before Sochi, or a number of non-state actors, also use that event to convey a counter-narrative to the one that the government or the powerful try to convey through the through the Great Olympics. This is more or less what happened in Mexico, although not necessarily planned. The events of 1968 just erupted, not because there was an Olympic game, but it all began to grow. But the thing is that it began to grow precisely before the Mexican Olympics of 1968, and this was something that needed to be stopped, according to the powerful, or to the people in power. I was just telling Victoria.
You mean the student activist protests?
Exactly, the protests. The protests that showed that Mexico did not live a normality as it was projected.
It was not according to the official script.
Exactly.
Of why we're inviting the
This
whole
was
world.
there was this other Mexico who was actually unhappy with the situation that prevailed in the country for 30 years, 38 years already, and they wanted to communicate that to the world, and they wanted to spoil the event by growing these massive protests throughout the streets. Although the movement, as I said, did not start because of the Olympics, it clearly began to intersect. So what I was telling Victoria earlier is that we live more or less a dark period, a dark in terms of the information that we received. I was in high school and in my undergrad program, and I wanted to go and investigate through the newspapers of the time and do a paper on what happened, and we could only find in UNAM library there was this edition of Excelsior, and it was all torn. And there was just a small piece of what happened. And it didn't even say what actually happened on the night of Tlatelolco. And I'm talking about October the 2nd. There was just a small piece. We could not reconstruct the story through the papers. So what someone as Elena Poniatowska did is you need to use the voices of people to reconstruct what happened, and more or less you start making sense of what must have happened that day, which is an attempt by the government to do everything in its power to stop the movement at a complete stop, so that it would not contaminate the coming days. It could not continue.
The world is watching. So
the world is watching.
Zero tolerance.
So there you have an intersection of politics and such a massive event as an Olympic Games.
Yeah. I can remember the 1978 World Cup vividly. I was going to school with Perla at the time, and I was 12. That's like peak obsessive age for following a World Cup if you're a soccer fan, and I wasn't focused on the politics or anything like that. I was all about the football. But even then, I do remember just being struck by how creepy some of the images appeared. So 1978. You're having a World Cup in Argentina. That is the height of the Guerra Sucia. I mean, you would see scenes of all of these, the guys in their uniforms presiding over the games, the junta, wearing like their dark glasses, and you could see that there was. I mean, there's obviously always a lot of security at these events, but you could just see military everywhere with the German shepherds, and it just kind of looked a little bit creepy and dark. I mean, I enjoyed the World Cup. I enjoyed the football, and and I don't know. No country boycotted again because that wasn't done. But there was a famous case of a Dutch player, Johan Cruyff, who said, "I am not going to Argentina." He was the best player of that generation. They lost in the final in overtime to Argentina, and again, Jesse Owens made a point by going to Berlin. Had Johan Cruyff gone to Argentina, maybe he could have made a point. So it's these moral judgments can be very tricky. Victoria, while a lot of our emphasis here is on the importance of an event like the World Cup and the Olympics for nations. I don't want us to not touch upon a very timely, topical subject on the intersection of sports and society and politics that we are living in the United States, that you have been a thought leader on and have written a lot about and thought a lot about in terms of the protests in the NFL. And I don't want to characterize them in any way because I might get in trouble, whether they're anthem protests but talk us a little bit about, again, what's at issue there, and how is that another illustration of how sports bring these issues to almost like a different level. And again, instead of being non-serious, sports is a way for people to be pointed in the direction of certain subjects that they might otherwise avoid. But when they intersect with sports, they intersect with the things that they care passionately about. So how do you see this playing out? And just talk us through a little bit, sort of like your perspective on the NFL protests that we've seen.
Thank you. To speak to what you were saying earlier, the criticism of the athlete activist is that how dare you bring politics to my sports? How dare you disrupt this thing we've worked so hard, whether it's hosting or, how dare you, $1 million paid athlete, just play the game, shut up and play, shut up and dribble. It was like what was directed at LeBron James when he started kind of growing his political voice. And what I say right back is, your politics are built into your sports structures, and if you are saying you are bringing politics to my sport, you just are not acknowledging your privilege, that you have politics at play. So by hosting the Olympics in '68, you have a very specific political agenda that you are trying to share with the world and show a very specific vision of this place to the world, which means quieting dissent, quieting those other voices, which is political because politics is power. And so for what's been going on in the last 5 or so years, there's kind of, scholars try to pick, okay, which moment was it when black athletes started kind of gaining their political voices again, because it seemed that they had lost that voice for a long time, which had been so strong in the 60s and 70s. And some people point to the protests in Ferguson, Missouri. Some actually go back a bit earlier to Trayvon Martin. So Trayvon Martin, and really it's just, with social media now, we see what had been occurring for decades and centuries, which is the killing of young black men and women by police officers. And now because people have cameras on their phones and a platform, social media, to share this, we now just know more about it. But within those communities, they knew, but didn't have a way to get that message out there. And so what happened with Trayvon Martin, who was a young black man who was killed by like a neighborhood watch person because he had like a package of candy that looked like a weapon, right? And he had a hood on, right? And so the politics of wearing a hood in the United States is if you're a person of color and you're wearing a hood, right, you're up to no good, you're gonna do something, maybe you're a member of a gang. If you're, everybody wears a hood. Like everybody wears a hoodie, so. But what happened was the Miami Heat, LeBron James and Dwayne Wade, posted a picture, and the entire team did it, where they all had hooded sweatshirts on with a message that said, "We are all Trayvon Martin." And then you have, so I think that's kind of the starting point. Then you have the St. Louis Rams football team, players come out of the tunnel in the hands up, don't shoot position, which was another police killing in New York City. And then it just grew and grew and grew from there. And so this preceded Colin Kaepernick. Colin Kaepernick was the athlete a couple years ago who started, at first he was just kind of sitting behind the team. Nobody even noticed. He was just sitting on the bench during the playing of the national anthem as a way he later expressed was a way to bring attention to police brutality and specifically the killing of young black and brown people by police officers. And then it transformed, and he went to members of the military to ask, how can I do this in a way that's respectful of the military? I don't want this to be misinterpreted as anti-military, anti-police, in that individuals who are working on police forces, and what he was told was to take a knee. So then he started taking a knee, and then this just spreads, and then of course our president decides to try to insert himself into this, and that just only makes the protests grow stronger. So my interpretation of it is that these are people who've made a decision. They know the consequences. They know that they're going to get death threats. They know because they've read their history. They know that that's what happened to John Carlos and Tommy Smith when they returned to the United States after the '68 games. They know. And that really takes a toll. And they believe that because, I don't mean to speak for them, what I see is that, you have a responsibility when you do have this platform to do something, to speak out when you see an injustice. And if anything, it's more patriotic, right, than standing kind of silently and obeying kind of the systems that be. It's more patriotic to call attention to ways in which we can work to make the country better. So that's my interpretation of what's been going on in the United States with the protests.
Actually, you mentioned patriotism, and it's interesting that when you look at a league like the NFL, it's not international competition. They're not playing against any other country, but the league itself does try to advance patriotism and associate. And I've heard you talk about this in other settings, that there is almost like we see in international events like an Olympics or a World Cup. There's this embrace of nationalism and patriotism. That's a two-way association between the league, but also the U.S. military and the government. Is that a new thing, and what does it consist of? Because I was surprised only recently to hear about the Pentagon having contracts for the flyovers and the flags, and I mean, what's your, so it kind of works both ways, right? I mean, what is going on there? Why is the NFL in the business of advancing, this patriotic and military messaging, which we see when we tune into the games?
That's a fantastic question. There's a few different ways to answer, but I'll try to keep it short. One is that after September 11th, and this is pulling from a new book that's out by Howard Bryant called The Heritage, and so it's not to say that this all started with September 11th. It by no means did it start then, but what we see is an increase in kind of a tolerance for a conflation of militarism, patriotism, and sport, and especially kind of sports with histories of spaces in which men assert and prove their power. So in the United States, it's American football and baseball, actually. And so these historically are spaces in which politicians have loved to play, because it's these places and spaces where you kind of assert your manliness. And even the origins of American football are very much tied to white male supremacy and training kind of the next generation of business and political and economic elite, because it's in our elite university systems that this game evolves out of soccer into American football, with a very kind of white men should be at the top of the hierarchy of our system, right, in the Jim Crow era and also in the globe. And one way to train young men for that is through the sport of American football, because it's kind of war in a safe space. It's practicing kind of the training of strong male bodies in a safe space. And then the people who watch the game can learn about what it means to be a strong male leader when they watch the game of football. And so after 9/11, yeah, you kind of referenced these contracts. We just kind of take things for granted, right? That oh, well, they've always played the national anthem before sporting events. Well, no, and the teams weren't always out on the field, you know, needing to stand at attention during the playing of the anthem. That doesn't start until 2009. A lot of this is very recent, but because we kind of just assume these rituals have taken place forever, we don't question why they've been inserted. And so, you know, the kind of military flyovers at sporting events, again, we just
and also the surprise family reunions when you have the returning servicemen and the families in the stadiums, and that's like a Pentagon contract. It's like product placement, right?
Yeah, and you know, we're kind of passively consuming this, so we just think, oh, this is just part of the natural order of things. But no, so the military paid the league to do that, and so the NFL is profiting off of the military kind of performing in this way in this space. And actually, it was our Arizona senators that found out about it and stopped it. But yeah, so you know, part of this is questioning what we take at kind of surface value, and kind of trying to get behind the reasons why people insert things into the sports space. What do they have to gain from it?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Somebody asked me earlier today, well, are you saying that you can't have a big sporting event that's not political? And I think when it comes to this level, they are all politicized. It's not just about Vladimir Putin or Adolf Hitler or the junta in Argentina. I mean, even looking ahead 4 years to Qatar World Cup, that is a very politicized event. The choice of which was also very interesting and politicized, but
you have one,
and they have an image, and then after that we have the North American World Cup, and that's also a political statement, a statement that I happen to agree with, that we're sharing this World Cup because we're a region, but you can't have an event at this scale without it having a political meaning. And
you have a current event regarding the Qatar issue. There was the soccer Golf Cup, which is a regional soccer cup, as we have it in North America, and we have it in the Caribbean. We have the Copa America, right? A regional. So it was boycotted by Saudi Arabia, by United Arab, because of the conflict, and the United Arab, and it had to be moved from Qatar. It was supposed to be in Qatar. It had to be moved. That was last year, 2017. It had to be moved from Qatar to Kuwait, and it happened in Kuwait, and then Saudi Arabia said, okay, we're coming, but only because it was moved. And you have another event, very recent event. There was supposed to be a match between the Argentina national team against Israel national team, and because of political issues regarding the Palestinians and all the Palestinian Football Association protest, that it was cancelled. This was just a month ago, but also the players began making statements, and then you can see the players of the national Argentina team. It was about time, they said. It was about time we make a protest to Israel. We cannot go and play in Israel, in Jerusalem. How come? We're not going to do that. So you're right. I think that these events become political.
So understanding, this might be a hard question, but understanding the power of politics, of sport in this political arena, if whoever is elected president of Mexico on July 1st calls you up on July 2nd and says, hey, Mauricio, I know you're a big shot on international relations at the Ibero, and I saw you did some crazy event recently with Comexi talking about sport, which kind of surprised me because I thought you were a serious person, but if he calls you and then he says, so what do you advise I do as the new president of Mexico to leverage sport in a way that's constructive to Mexican identity and political interests? Is there something you would advise?
Well, I would have to move the question and see and tell him that you can use actually sports, not necessarily sports events, to help build peace in the country. You need to really foster sports at the local level with correct programs that can enhance the sense of peace in local communities. Now, if you do want to project, well, you have your table has been served because you have a World Cup coming, and we can use that as a projection of the Mexican stability. Mexico has a terrible image right now in everywhere because of the violence that our country is experiencing. It's not the only story that is told about Mexico, but it is constantly told everywhere. So you could use a sports event to show people outside of Mexico don't actually believe that things are going on behind gun shootings, besides kidnappings, besides drug trafficking. There's another narrative about what is actually going on in Mexico, and I'm not necessarily talking about helping a political actor to foster its own agenda. I am talking about actually telling a different story about Mexico, which is what you can see everywhere. And there's a number of things that need to be told also about the country, besides the story of violence that is constantly told everywhere.
No, and I think it's a good point to underscore that I didn't want to suggest, and I'm glad you're affirming that the political influences of sport don't always have to be negative, and we don't have to always be cynical about them. We've seen, and again, there are cases in which sport serves a very benign, positive influence in society. Again, because I've been following the English Premier League very closely this year, one of the great stories has been Mo Salah, who's the Egyptian attacker for Liverpool, and he's the most famous Muslim athlete these days, and to watch fans in Liverpool chant, if you score some more, we'll become Muslim too. It's a very heartfelt chant where it alters perceptions of how people, quiénes son los nuestros y quiénes son los otros, no? And you see what it means in Germany to have a generation of German kids running around with jerseys that have number 10 on the back and the name Özil, which is a Turkish name because their most gifted player is a Turkish immigrant family. Yeah, and I mean, he's German, but for most of its history, German understanding of nationality was, I don't care if your parents came, if your grandparents came, once a Turk, always a Turk, and now I'm wearing the jersey with that. And this is part of your course in terms of our history with race relations and baseball and how sports affected people's understanding of segregation. We both know a historian who's written books on how this played out with soccer in Brazil to alter understandings of Brazilian nationhood, and the Scratch do Ouro became a way for people to identify with a multiracial society. So do you want to I'll let you add a word to that, and then I do want to take questions from the audience. Big topic.
Thank you.
Go.
I actually, because I've been talking a lot about race, I'd like to flip it and talk about gender, if you don't mind.
Please do.
And in the United States, we're unique, and I hate talking about the uniqueness of the United States because then I'm like falling into arguments about American exceptionalism, blah, blah, blah. So I'm not doing that. Except in this one space, which is that kind of an unintended consequence, so it wasn't deliberate, of the passage of a law we have called Title IX, and it's Title IX of the Educational Amendments of 1972, which basically says there cannot be any gender discrimination in educational institutions. And so this law makes its way through Congress, And basically, they don't think about the fact that sport will be part of this because in the United States, sport is built into the school structure. And I mean, there's like congressmen as they're debating this, like making jokes like, oh yeah, let's totally, like, yeah, like the locker room's gonna be awesome now because there's gonna be girls there too. So they're like making a joke, they don't even realize. And so because sport, competitive elite sport is organized within the school system within the United States, and because the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, as they're figuring out how to put law into practice, is like, yep, we're gonna do this in physical education and we're gonna do this in competitive elite sports too. Now it's required by law that schools, K through 12 and colleges, have to provide equal opportunity when it comes to sport. And so what we have going on in the United States is that we have now more than one generation of girls and women who've grown up taking for granted that they get to play sports just like the boys do. And what I like to point to is that Title IX desegregated by gender physical education. So our PE classes in schools before that, the boys had boys PE, the girls had girls PE, and Title IX brought them together. And like, they're not going to subject the boys to the silly exercises they had the girls doing, so the girls got to start playing competitive sports too with the boys. That is so empowering for young girls because you feel strong when you play sports, and you feel strong when you're playing sports with the boys.
And all the boys discovered that Victoria was faster than they are. But
and I could take them in basketball
but just to flesh this out a little bit, because you know we both work at Arizona State University, which is a fabulous university. I can talk to you about that later. But it's also a university, like most universities in the States, that takes sports very seriously. We play in the Pacific Conference, and like a lot of universities, we give athletic scholarships. So am I correct that under Title IX, for every male athletic scholarship, you have to have the same number? So when you look at the American football team, you know, all those kids are getting free tuition because they're gifted football players, but the university has to create an equal number of opportunities for female athletes, such as yourself. Is that correct? Is that the same number? Is that the way it's?
The scholarship money.
The scholarship money.
Yeah. But if you look at Fortune 500 companies in the United States and you look at the women who've made it to the kind of positions of power and authority, to a T, almost all of them played sports. And so sport as a pathway to kind of gaining the confidence in self to go on and achieve things in other spaces. And also, like, it's not just the girls, it's the boys too. I'll tell a really quick story. So I talk about what it was like to play college sports before the passage of Title IX for girls, and like they're sewing their own uniforms, they're like, you know, all cramming like 20 girls into like a minivan, they're all sleeping in the same hotel room when they're traveling to events, and then they look to the men's teams and they're flying in chartered planes and like staying at these posh hotels and like the medical support and stuff like that. And so I'll speak about this, and almost every semester now I'll have a male student come up to me after class and be like, I cannot believe I know this now. My mom played college sports in the 70s and I'm gonna go home and talk to her about it now. And then they come back with these like stories, and so we're not that far removed from it, but now again we have this generation of girls who really have and so also colleges in the United States are majority women now because of Title IX. It removed the use of quotas in professional schools, and so it's been a really powerful law, and we associate it as a sports law now too.
Yeah, it's usually when you hear about it. Well, I'm tempted to keep talking with you two, but I want to also open it up for comentarios, preguntas. Yes.
So thank you, first of all, for being here.
I think we want you to wait for the microphone. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Aline. I'm actually in the youth member program of Comexi. And thank you so much for being here. Mauricio, my favorite professor from Ibero. So we have two scenarios right now, a cooperative scenario where the US, Mexico, and Canada are organizing the next 2026 World Cup, and then a tough scenario where NAFTA negotiations are taking place and the whole NAFTA agreement is in sort of like, we'll see. So is there a way that the World Cup negotiation can help soften NAFTA agreements in a positive way, and if so, how?
Give me the tough questions.
You're the favorite.
You trained me well.
No, I don't think so. With this president and with the current situation, I think it's gonna walk in different paths. Not to say that it doesn't matter, but according to what I perceive up to this moment, I believe that he's basically making decisions upon issues that take place during the coming months, and if he keeps warring the trading wars, if he keeps fighting the trade wars with a number of countries, not only Mexico but in general, then it will suit the narrative and the discourse and the agenda to also move out from NAFTA, or to try to make a different NAFTA. For example, the proposal he did about having two different treaties, one with Canada and another one with Mexico, and that is running on a different path. And I don't believe, unfortunately, that the good news about the World Cup and the North American World Cup would impact this particular president's agenda. That's my view.
Yes.
Thank you all for coming. Very interesting. Sean Hardingham from the U.S. Embassy Political Section. And I was hoping that someone on the panel could address China's recent efforts to grow their soccer team, and how you see that influencing their reach outside of the Asia-Pacific region.
Do you have thoughts on China? I'm just asking. I don't. Okay. Well, it's a head scratcher, which is why I don't know what to say. It's a head scratcher why China hasn't moved up in the rankings, literally, metaphorically, of world football, because there's a lot of passion for the sport. I think of China as this really interesting. When I was talking earlier about whether the U.S. Dominates global pop culture. I always like telling people, if you bring together a teenager from Nigeria and Mexico and Korea and Germany, what are they going to have in common? They're going to be able to talk about the latest Hollywood blockbusters. They're probably going to be able to talk about American music. If they communicate at all, it's most likely going to be in English. The one shared piece of content that they might have that's not produced in the U.S. is soccer. They might be able to say, hey, no, Ronaldo, no, Messi, and did you see the last World Cup? These are broad generalizations, but by and large. And China is this really fascinating market where both English football and our American sports are really clashing to gain market share and hearts and minds. During the period of the Cultural Revolution, sports were considered bourgeois, and so it was kind of when China had its own opening after the Cultural Revolution, it was like, blank slate in terms of sports, and so you had a great opportunity for the U.S. because you didn't have incumbent sports in the way that you had in a lot of other places. And so the NBA took off, and there was a very famous Chinese player in the NBA. But obviously there's, the English Premier League, which I keep talking about, makes tons of money with the TV contracts in China. Some of the owners of the clubs are Chinese.
You go to Beijing during the European Champions League and people are up all night watching the games because of the time difference. This year they moved Real Madrid Barcelona to noon in Spain, which incensed Spaniards, and the reason for that was they wanted it to be on prime time in Asia. So the Chinese president is obsessed with soccer. When he went to do a state visit in the UK, he told David Cameron, I don't want my state visit to be in London, I want it to be in Manchester. Could I visit Old Trafford? Could I go to a Manchester United practice? So this, city of Manchester, which is the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, which has sort of been forgotten in the shadows by London, the one thing it still has is suddenly it finds itself as the center of world football with the Pep Guardiola, Jose Mourinho rivalry in this United and City, and one of the teams is owned by American billionaires and the other one by the Sheikh of Abu Dhabi. Anyways, don't get me started on that topic. But it was striking that the leader of China said, take me to Manchester, I don't want to go to London. So with all of this obsession in China for football, and they're bringing in a lot of European kind of older players and spending a lot of money on youth development. It is, I'm talking a lot because I don't really have an answer as to why, given the sort of low level of competitiveness of Asian soccer relative to other parts of the world, you would think China would certainly dominate within Asia, and yet you see that China struggles so much. I think, don't quote me on this, but I think they've only qualified to one World Cup in any time in our recent memories. They didn't qualify this time. They can't be Saudi Arabia to go to the World Cup. And I think China does appreciate, we saw this with the Beijing Olympics. They certainly appreciate the value of sport as a sort of credential to the world, and they've really risen in the rankings of Olympic, medal count and as a way of validating the nation. And there's something about doing it internationally in soccer that seems to be more difficult. And certainly, when I talk to people in the English clubs as I do my research, they are all praying to find that Chinese star, that much like the player who came to the NBA, Yao Ming, thank you, who played in Houston, who helped make the NBA huge in China. I mean, the first team in Europe that brings over a Chinese star. We've seen it with Korean players and Japanese players who do start in the Premier League and become de facto the team of that country, just like when Chicharito signed with Leverkusen in Germany a couple years ago. The Bayer Leverkusen server just collapsed because they couldn't take the amount of traffic they were suddenly getting, because you had millions of people in Mexico being and they were going to the site. So if you can so what I'm saying is there's so much interest in developing Chinese soccer, both among the Chinese, obviously, the party, the government, and even European clubs. And why it hasn't happened is a great research project that maybe Victoria could take on, or some of our colleagues, because it just doesn't make sense, just given the economics, but I do think that once it does happen, once there is a turning point where China becomes competitive in football, and we've seen this in the U.S. The U.S. used to be a joke in soccer within my lifetime. Granted, it's a long lifetime, but more recently it's become competitive despite this World Cup's failure to qualify. I think when China starts getting to that stature, I think it'll have a huge influence in terms of the soft power and cultural influence within the region, but also within Europe, because it's again one of the aspects of life that people care a lot about, that China continues to be absent from. China, since the Cultural Revolution to now, it's been a process of entering into a lot of our spaces. We're starting to see Chinese brands. We're very aware of China in many aspects of life, and it remains a great absence that they're not in the football, in the soccer space. But
I'm sorry. So I'm going to apologize before I do this. So I'm sorry. But China is good at soccer, and the U.S. is good at soccer, and they do fantastically in the World Cup, and we just modify it by calling it the women.
Very good point.
So that's why I apologized before I said it.
Don't apologize.
But Asia's great at soccer. It's women's soccer. Japan historically, is one of the greatest rivals with the U.S. and China, too. A number of those World Cup finals have been either U.S.-China or U.S.-Japan. And the U.S. has a great soccer team. We just modify it by calling it the women's national team, but we have a great national team.
And again, these were spaces where there wasn't the entrenched incumbency. There wasn't the entrenched incumbency of powers. I mean, when women's soccer became more popular, you had a greater opening for countries like the U.S. and China, who were in historic powers in the sport, to assert leadership because it hadn't been a priority of the Germanys and the Englands but I think that's a very good point, and it goes to China has become superpower in sports, but when it comes to men's soccer, and please add the adjective men's when you added this to everything I've said about soccer and China before, but that is a good point.
Let me just add here that it all has to do with I mean the comment that Victoria made right now makes me think of how much sports are really intertwined with power. The first time, on another count, but it's also a story of power, the first time I became a Dallas Cowboys fan was...
Nobody told me you were a Cowboys fan. We need to change the panel.
Was when I saw a poster in my brother's room. It was a huge poster because Dallas Cowboys were the world champions. So I said, oh, they're the world champions, which means that they very likely, I was I don't know, 7 years old, 8 years old, and I understood that they went to a World Cup and they won the World Cup, so they were the world champions. Then I found out they only the match was against Denver, and they beat Denver, and that was the world tournament.
It's a different time zone. And then we had the World Series in baseball.
Oh, the World Series, yes, of course, which I'm a big fan of.
We had a question back there.
Sorry,
oh, okay. Here and then there.
Okay. Hi, I'm Mercedes Migoya. I'm also from the Young Associates program in Comexi. And my question is more focused on the local level. I like what Mauricio was saying about like peace building through sports. And Iceland has like this big successful story about how they beat drugs with like pushing sports with teenagers. And I'd like to know, like, what does Mexico need? Because, like, if you compare, for example, our population, we're like huge compared to Iceland. So, what do we need? Do we need tools? Do we need like a cultural push? Because also, another thing that comes to my mind is, when I studied abroad, and for example, in the States, you have like these groups of people who, like, if you're in the band, you'll have maybe you're a geek, but you have your band friends, no? And here in Mexico, it's terrible. Like, you do this sport or that sport, and we don't have like all these options. So what do we need to do to like push this?
Let me move in here with a little bit of the proposals we have been making, because that's part of what I have been researching on, and not only sports, but sports as a tool among other tools, other instruments that need to be pushed. I would say collaboratively. You cannot ask from the government everything. In Mexico, we tend to look up at the government and ask from the government that they do everything we need for the country to solve our problems. We do need collaborative programs that are designed in the short term, in the mid-term, and in the long term, because otherwise you cannot solve it. And you cannot change sports culture from the morning to the next day, and we need short-term goals, mid-term goals, and long-term goals, which involve the public sector, also the private sector, also the municipal sector, the local level, with the schools, universities, with the scholars, with the mass media, and with basically designing local, very, very local specific programs, possibly in my school, possibly in my neighborhood. We have a wonderful program which is in New Orleans that it's called midnight basketball. I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's called midnight basketball, and basketball is played at midnight in the most dangerous areas of the city, and it has proven to reduce crime if you combine it with other tools. It's not only by itself. You also need to focus on the local police building, but so among other tools, I'm just saying that it's not alone. You cannot use sports alone, but it proves to be a very interesting tool as a peace builder in terms of what can it create for youth, how people devote their time to something constructive, but also as a de-stress factor, which is also something that we have been proving. There's a lot of stress in Mexico right now because of violence, stress related to violence. And when you do sports, you reduce stress. It's a cheap and easy way to reduce stress. So if you propose this program to a local government, and they can see what they can do in their area, or to a local company. We pay visits to different companies also, and to different levels, and we are trying to push this. We need, of course, to push harder, and we need them to understand the importance of tools such as sports, also tools such as arts, and other different kinds of tools to help our situation. I hope that answers.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you very much. My name is Jose Beltran. I'm from Ibero. I'm a student of political science. We saw a very powerful picture last February in Pyongyang Olympics, where the North Korean and the South Korean leaders were watching the inauguration of the Olympic Games together. We also saw the Korean athletes, the North Korean, the South Korean athletes walking together under the same flag. And we also, there was a very funny, I would say, thing that happened recently with the summit in Singapore, where CNN interviewed Dennis Rodman, the Worm, an NBA player that is friends with Kim Jong-un. So my question is, what do you think is the role of sports in the relaunching of the relationship with North Korea, and how do you think that will help to scale down the tension between the two countries?
That's a fantastic example of how sports can play this role, and it's one you're embarrassing me because it's one I should have mentioned in the introduction, but it's fantastic. But there's so many, right? And I'm struck by the contrast. South Korea had an Olympics in Seoul in the 90s. 88? Wow, how time flies. In 88. And that Olympics was very much, I feel, at that point, the South Korean regime wanted to assert itself as, we are the modern first world, Korea, in opposition to that other Korea up north. It was very much a way to be distinct from. And then, now we have a very different message coming out of Pyongyang, which is, can we use, in January you had worries that the world was going to go to war because Trump was sending insulting tweets. If you haven't heard, our President of the United States is fond of Twitter, calling Little Rocket Man and all this stuff, and people were very nervous, and even when Obama left the White House, he told Trump, the one thing you really need to keep your eye on is North Korea. So that was happening at the beginning of this year, and then a month later, as you point out, that Olympics was utilized by a very different South Korean government than the one in '88 to say, could we use this as a space to do something where peoples from our countries that are still technically at war. There's a truce in place, but the war technically is still going on from the 50s between the two Koreas. Could we use this as a way for people to engage
in a different way and maybe explore commonalities, and literally, as you point out, the commonality of identity with the same, players playing together and what that represented. And that was kind of almost, it felt like a necessary antecedent to then having the two leaders meet. I mean, prior to Singapore, the North Korean and South Korean leaders met at the DMZ, and there was that great video of Kim Jong-un like pulling the South Korean president over to the northern side. And so I think it is I think it's a positive example of how governments can use this as a safer space to reach out and get people more comfortable with the idea that, hey, we might have a lot in common with our neighbors, and in this case, people who are also Korean, but just because of history and politics we're divided. Then to have the first step be, I, head of state, am going to go to this other country. And it reminds me of when I was a little kid watching the 1974 World Cup. So I mentioned the 78, but in 74, turning on the TV and watching Germany play Germany, which was really confusing. I was 8. I thought I liked Germany, but then I was like confused because it was Germany against Germany, and so which Germany am I supposed to root for? And as a good, Mexicano I knew democratic was a good term, so I was like, maybe democratic Germany is the one I should root for. And then my dad came in the room and he's like, well, actually the federal Germany is kind of like the good Germans, so that was his politics. But I think that World Cup was for Germans a similar way to reach across literally the wall and engage each other in a way that was more healthy. I don't know if you guys have other thoughts of cases, and particularly the Korean case.
I would add, I think you commented it very, very broadly and very well. I would only add the two things. One, that the other side of this coin was the fear that was being created precisely because everything that happened during 2017 and all these nuclear tests and all these missile tests and everything, all the rhetoric scaling up, because of that there was a lot of fear about what could happen during the Pyeongchang Games and how could someone intervene to diffuse what was these dynamics that was scaling up. So there was actually a huge activity, diplomatic activity behind the scenes during 2017 by President Moon and different actors that actually wanted to use the games as a pretext, you would say, as a very good reason to change the dynamics that was taking place, and it worked. It worked very nicely. So you could say that, I mean, is not necessarily the cause for what we are watching right now, but it was definitely a contributing factor to what we are watching now, to these new dynamics, and we hope it goes well. Of course, there's a lot of things that need to be resolved before we can actually say that peace has come to triumph. But definitely the games did make a good starting point, because before the games there was also a number of signs that a number of actions that were taken before the games as good actions, so that the games would be the best place to show that the two Koreas were already marching together towards peace. By the way, the other games that the two Koreas marched towards peace or marched together was in Sydney 2000. Unfortunately, after that, nothing else happened. But yes, in Sydney they marched together also.
So one more question, and then I think we need to break.
Hello, my name is Linda Duno. I studied in Universidad Iberoamericana ages ago, and I'm very happy that I was invited to this because I love sports.
I didn't know this was an Ibero-only crowd. I see another Ibero graduate over there.
I love sports and I love politics. You have mentioned several examples about how sports have or could promote peace and friendship. And you have certainly also mentioned the opposite, but this is a tough one. The case of Israel, you mentioned that the match between Argentina and Israel was canceled. But I wonder, I would like your opinion, do you think that the fact that Israel's participation in world sports is so low is because after Munich 1972, or it's just the world pressure that, because I don't think that Israel doesn't have athletes that have the capability to participate in big things. Maybe it's Israel's politics not to bring their athletes to the world sports arena. It's a tough one.
I have a couple things to say, but no solution or, direct answer to your question. The first, we were talking about this earlier today. I was prepping, right? And I learned that, during the World Wars, the Olympics were canceled, right, of course, in 40 and 44. And so London hosts the first Olympics after the World Wars in 48. And they, want to do it in a way that's kind of bringing the people together again. This is before we kind of have the grandiose spending. London is still rebuilding, right? And Italy is invited to participate in Germany and Japan or not. And Israel is in the process of becoming a new state, and much like many countries that are new states or decolonizing and gaining their independence during this moment, and especially in the 50s and 60s, they join FIFA and the IOC before they join the UN. And some of them before they actually have full independence. I think Algeria is one example of like the national team forms before the nation forms. But Israel wants to compete in London in 48, and how the IOC handles it is that, and what happens is Arab states aren't going to go and participate, so they are threatening a boycott. And what the IOC does, right, they're not political, they're like, oh, we're still processing your paperwork, sorry, you're going to have to wait until 52 Helsinki to participate. So I think there's that component. Absolutely, I think your theory about Munich 72 plays into this, and part of what facilitates that is like Germany wants to present an image to the world that it's this like peaceful, friendly place, and they don't want the optics of lots of security and guns, which is how people get into the Olympic Village, because like the security personnel don't even have weapons, and those who do, like they don't have bullets, and like the walkie-talkies don't even work. It's horrible because they're so concerned about presenting this image to the world that they're a peaceful, happy, friendly, non-armed state after the wars and also after Berlin. But on a personal level, I know a number of American athletes of Jewish ancestry that compete for Israel in the Olympics. So it's not necessarily Israelis who are competing for Israel in various international competitions. It's people in the Jewish diaspora who can then switch their citizenship and compete for Israel. So one of my high school teammates is a pole vaulter. Women participate in pole vault now. It's a relatively new Olympic event, and because the United States has this system in which we develop girls in sport in the school system, she competed for the US and won Olympics, and then the next two subsequent Olympic Games she competed for Israel. So there's kind of a patchwork response to your question, but that's a tough one. as you stated.
And also there's a factor. Israelis say, they like to joke a lot about this. Of course, there's politics and all this, but there's also the fact that Israelis are not necessarily as good. They're very good at several things, but they're not always as good at soccer. They're not always as good at other sports. That's what they like to joke about. I'm not very much into their sports situation. I don't even know about how their women teams perform. I'm not sure, but I know what I hear, and they always like to joke about how they're not good. They're not particularly very, very good at different sports. That's all I would say. I would add. But there's definitely the political factor there. Israel cannot play in its own area. Israel needs to play in Europe. And because you play against the European teams, you're never at the World Cup. Of course, if you play against Panama and against Trinidad and Tobago, you'd probably be at the World Cup more often. But then you need to play against Italy, against Spain, against Germany. Of course, you will never go to the World Cup. Not easy. Israel came to the Mexican World Cup, by the way, 1970. Oh, yeah. Israel was here.
Well, I think we've proven it's a very rich topic. I want to keep going for a couple of hours. You probably have places to go and things to do. So I'm going to have to tell myself to cut it. But thank you so much for coming, and thank you guys for being such great panelists and with us. And special thanks to Mariana for making this happen. I'm a huge fan of COMEXI, and we at Arizona State are thrilled to be doing a lot in collaboration with you. Really respect and admire the work that COMEXI does as a leading voice in Mexico that brings together people from a lot of different backgrounds to be kind of a key think tank and thought leader on international relations and how Mexico connects to the world. So it's been a great pleasure getting to know you in COMEXI. Thank you, everybody. Thanks.